The silence was the most terrifying sound of all. For 6 years, the continent of Europe had been torn apart by the thunder of artillery, the scream of dive bombers, and the mechanical grind of tank tracks. But by the spring of 1945, as the German war machine collapsed into rust and ruin, a strange quiet began to descend over the pockets of surrender. It was in this silence that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves standing on the precipice of an uncertain fate. They were exhausted, starving, and stripped of their illusions. For the average Lancer, the foot soldier of the Wehrmacht, the war was over. But the struggle for survival had just entered a new, confusing chapter. They were no longer conquerors. They were numbers in a ledger, liabilities to be fed, and millions of men were about to be swept up into the greatest logistical undertaking of incarceration in human history. Among the smoking ruins of the Ruhr pocket and along the banks of the Rhine, a desperate calculation was being made in the minds of every German soldier. To the east lay the Soviet Red Army, fueled by a righteous vengeance for the atrocities committed on their soil. Surrender there promised hard labor, freezing gulags, and a very slim chance of return. To the west lay the Americans and the British. Rumors had spread through the ranks like wildfire, whispers of fair treatment, of food, of survival. Entire units, sometimes disobeying direct orders from the dissolving high command, turned their backs to the east and marched west, desperate to be captured by the Americans. They threw down their Mauser rifles, raised their hands, and walked into a captivity that would vary wildly depending on whose flag flew over the camp. For those lucky enough to fall into American hands, their journey would be a study in contrasts, from the muddy hell of the Rhine meadows to a surreal existence in a land of unimaginable plenty across the ocean. As we embark on this deep exploration of the German POW experience, a story of hunger, hope, labor, and the clash of cultures, take a quick moment to subscribe to the channel. This history is vast and complex, and you won't want to miss the upcoming episodes where we uncover the British and French perspectives. The initial experience of American captivity was far from the luxury that propaganda later suggested. In the spring of 1945, the sheer volume of prisoners overwhelmed the Allied logistical capabilities. The United States Army was prepared to handle thousands of prisoners, not millions. When the Ruhr pocket collapsed, over 300,000 German soldiers surrendered in a matter of days. The result was the creation of the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. These were not prisons in the traditional sense. They were vast, open fields surrounded by barbed wire, with the Rhine River acting as a natural barrier. For the men herded into these enclosures, the first weeks were a brutal shock. There were no barracks, no tents, and no sanitation facilities. The prisoners were stripped of their equipment and herded onto the muddy floodplains. It was a wet, cold spring. To survive the biting wind and the relentless rain, men dug holes in the ground with their bare hands or tin cans, huddling together like animals in earth burrows to conserve body heat. Water was scarce, and food was even scarcer. The Americans, overwhelmed by the numbers and facing supply line shortages, struggled to feed this sudden city of captives. Rations were cut to the bare minimum. Dysentery spread through the camps, and the muddy ground turned into a quagmire of human waste and misery. In these initial weeks, the American dream seemed like a cruel joke. The designation given to these men was often disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, a legal distinction that allowed the Allies to bypass certain requirements of the Geneva Convention regarding food and housing standards, simply because the resources to meet those standards did not exist in the shattered infrastructure of Germany. However, for hundreds of thousands of these men, the misery of the Rhine meadows was temporary. The United States needed labor, and they had a massive logistical network returning empty ships to North America. A decision was made that would change the lives of nearly 380,000 German soldiers. They were to be shipped across the Atlantic to the United States. The transition from the mud of the Rhine to the transport ships was jarring. Men were deloused, processed, and marched onto Liberty ships, the very vessels that had brought the weapons to defeat them. For a young German soldier who had spent years hearing propaganda about the decaying mongrel nation of America, the voyage was a revelation. As the coast of Europe faded into the mist, they were leaving behind a continent of rubble, ash, and starvation. They were sailing toward a land that had not seen a single bomb drop on its cities. The journey across the Atlantic was fraught with a strange irony. The prisoners were locked in the holds, and for the first few days, many were terrified of U-boats, German submarines that might torpedo their own countrymen. But as the days passed, the fear gave way to astonishment. It started with the food. On the transport ships, even the simple rations seemed like a feast compared to the sawdust bread and watered-down soup of the final war years. They were given white bread, something many younger soldiers had effectively never seen. They tasted coffee that wasn't made of roasted barley. They saw the American sailors throwing half-eaten food overboard, a sight that horrified and mesmerized men who had recently fought over potato peelings. The arrival in the United States was a psychological shockwave. Most transports docked in Boston, New York, or Norfolk. Imagine the perspective of a 20-year-old from a bombed-out village in Bavaria standing on the deck as the ship entered New York Harbor. They saw the Statue of Liberty, but more importantly, they saw the skyline. The skyscrapers stood tall and unbroken. The city was ablaze with lights. In Europe, the blackout had been a way of life for years. Darkness was safety. Here, cars drove with their headlights on, neon signs flickered, and windows were unbarred. It was a display of power and abundance that defeated the Wehrmacht more thoroughly than any artillery barrage. It signaled that they had fought a war they never could have won against a nation with such untouched industrial might. Upon arrival, the prisoners were stripped, showered, and issued new clothing. Often, these were surplus American uniforms with the letters PW stenciled in large white or yellow characters on the back and legs. They were loaded onto trains to be distributed to camps across the country. The train ride itself was an education in geography. They traveled for days without crossing a border, watching the landscape shift from the industrial East to the endless cornfields of the Midwest, or the cotton fields of the South. They realized the sheer scale of the United States. One prisoner later recalled looking out the window at the endless procession of Ford and Chevrolet cars on the highways and realizing that the Nazi propaganda about American weakness was a total fabrication. The camps in the United States were strictly run according to the Geneva Convention. The War Department was acutely aware that Americans were being held captive in Germany, and they wanted to ensure that the treatment of German POWs in the U.S. would guarantee reciprocal treatment for American boys abroad. This policy resulted in what the Germans called the Golden Cage. Life in an American POW camp was regimented, but, by the standards of the time, incredibly comfortable. The most shocking aspect was the diet. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners must be fed the same quality and quantity of food as the base troops of the captivating power. The U.S. Army soldier in 1944 ate very well, and therefore so did the German prisoner. Breakfasts included eggs, bacon, milk, and cereal. Lunches and dinners featured meat, beef, pork, chicken, vegetables, fruits, and desserts. For men who had spent the Russian front surviving on frozen horse meat or the retreat from France eating raw turnips, the American mess hall was a paradise. There are countless anecdotes of German prisoners becoming sick in their first week, simply because their shrunken stomachs could not handle the richness and volume of the food. They gained weight rapidly. They had access to cigarettes, chocolate, and beer, which they could purchase with scrip earned from their labor. In the canteen, they could buy toiletries, writing paper, and sometimes even Coca-Cola. But they were not guests. They were a labor force. With millions of American men away fighting, the U.S. economy faced a severe labor shortage, particularly in agriculture. The German POWs were the solution. They were deployed to harvest corn in Nebraska, pick cotton in Texas, can tomatoes in Indiana, and log timber in the Pacific Northwest. This labor was not forced in the brutal sense of a concentration camp. It was paid work, regulated by safety standards. The interaction between the German prisoners and the American civilian population is one of the most fascinating aspects of this history. In the rural heartland of America, the ideological hatred of Nazism was often abstract. Farmers needed help, and the government sent them strong, disciplined young men who knew how to work the land. Many of the German prisoners came from farming backgrounds themselves. When they stepped onto a farm in Iowa or Kansas, they didn't see the enemy. They saw soil that needed tiling and crops that needed harvesting. Relationships formed. Despite rules against fraternization, humanity often broke through. Farmers would invite the prisoners to sit at the family table for lunch. They would share lemonade on a hot afternoon. There are recorded instances of prisoners acting as babysitters for the farmers' children while the parents worked. In small towns, the prisoners became a familiar sight. On Sundays, some camps allowed soccer matches that the locals would come to watch. In some bizarre twists of fate, German prisoners guarded by a single sleepy GI would drive trucks into town to pick up supplies. This is not to say that every German was a benign farm boy or that every American was welcoming. Hardcore Nazis remained within the prisoner population. In the camps, a shadow war was fought between the anti-Nazis, or those who had simply given up on the ideology, and the true believers. The true believers, often members of the SS or the Afrika Korps, who had been captured earlier while morale was still high, tried to maintain discipline and ideological purity. They set up kangaroo courts inside the barracks to try fellow prisoners for treason. Treason defined as cooperating too willingly with the Americans or speaking ill of Hitler. There were beatings, and in some tragic cases, murders within the camps, often staged as suicides. The American authorities eventually caught on to this and began a process of segregation, separating the die-hard Nazis from the rest of the population to protect the moderates. The intellectual life in the Golden Cage was also surprisingly rich. The YMCA and other organizations provided books, musical instruments, and educational materials. Camps established their own newspapers, orchestras, and theater troupes. Universities in the U.S. even offered correspondence courses for prisoners. A German soldier could, in theory, learn advanced mathematics or English literature while waiting for the war to end. The Americans launched a re-education program aimed at denazifying the prisoners not through torture, but through exposure to democracy. They showed films, provided American newspapers, and held history classes. The effectiveness of this program is debated, but for many prisoners, the simple reality of American life was the best re-education. Seeing a society that functioned without a secret police, where the average citizen had a car and a refrigerator, made the promises of the Third Reich look empty and primitive. One specific memory from a prisoner named Hans illustrates the surreal nature of this captivity. He was sent to a camp in Texas. He recalled that on Christmas Eve 1944, the camp commander allowed them to set up a Christmas tree. The prisoners sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night. To their surprise, the American guards took off their helmets and stood in silence, listening. Afterward, the guards shared their own Christmas rations with the prisoners. Hans wrote later that it was in that moment he realized the propaganda about the soulless American gangsters was a lie. He was not being treated as a monster, but as a man. However, the golden cage had bars. They were still prisoners. They were thousands of miles from home, with no knowledge of whether their families in Berlin, Dresden, or Hamburg were alive or dead. Letters took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. They watched the newsreels in the camp cinemas, seeing their own cities reduced to rubble. The psychological toll of knowing they were safe and well-fed while their mothers and children were likely starving in cellars was immense. This guilt was a constant companion to the white bread and beef. As the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the status of the prisoners changed. The urgency of the war effort faded, but the labor shortage remained. The United States kept the German POWs for nearly another year to help with the harvest of 1945 and the transition to a peacetime economy. But the mood began to shift. The revelations of the Holocaust, the concentration camps liberated by Allied troops, shocked the American public. The friendly farmhand was suddenly looked at with suspicion. Was he one of those who did that? The prisoners were forced to watch documentaries of the camps, like the film commissioned by the Allies showing the piles of bodies at Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen. For many ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, this was a moment of horror and denial. Some wept, others refused to believe it, claiming it was Hollywood trickery. But the atmosphere in the camps cooled. The camaraderie with the guards became more distant. By 1946, the pressure to repatriate the prisoners grew. But here, the American paradox took a final, complicated turn. The United States did not simply send all the men home. While some were released directly to Germany, a significant number were handed over to Britain and France, who were desperate for labor to rebuild their shattered countries. The men who had spent 2 years eating steak and driving tractors in Kansas were suddenly loaded onto ships, believing they were going home, only to find themselves transferred to the custody of other Allied powers. They were leaving the golden cage, but they were not yet free. The American experience remains a unique chapter in the history of warfare. It was an anomaly, a captivity defined by abundance, rather than deprivation. For the 380,000 men who experienced it, it shaped their view of the world forever. They returned to Germany in the late 40s, often in better physical health than when they had left, wearing American-style clothes and speaking English with a Midwestern twang. They became the bridge builders of the post-war era, the generation that would align West Germany firmly with the United States. They had seen the enemy up close, and they had found not a monster, but a farmer, a mechanic, and a society that, despite being their conqueror, had treated them with a humanity they had not expected. But while the sun set on the comfortable barracks in Texas and the cornfields of Nebraska, a very different reality was unfolding for those who had fallen into the hands of the British. Across the ocean, in the damp and fog of the United Kingdom, His Majesty's government was preparing a different kind of reception. There, the focus would not be on calories and cotton, but on the mind, on the complex psychological project of turning enemies into democrats. The golden cage was about to be replaced by the rigorous discipline of the British Isles. As we close this chapter on the American experience, we must prepare to cross the Atlantic back to Europe. The story is far from over. The German prisoners are about to become His Majesty's guests, and later they will face the brutal realities of French Reconstruction. The contrast will be shocking. If you found this exploration of the Golden Cage fascinating, please make sure you are subscribed. In the next part, we will delve into the British camps, where re-education was a science, and where the intricate class system of the UK collided with the hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. You won't want to miss the story of how Britain tried to fix the German mind. If the American experience was defined by material abundance, a golden cage of white bread, steaks, and sunny cotton fields, the British experience was defined by something entirely different: the mind. As we leave the vast landscapes of the United States and cross the gray, churning waters of the Atlantic to the British Isles, the atmosphere shifts dramatically. Here, there was no surplus. There were no skyscrapers lighting up the night sky, untouched by war. Britain in 1945 was a victor, but a battered one. Its cities were scarred by the Blitz, its economy was shattered, and its people were living under strict rationing that would persist for years. For the German prisoner of war arriving in the UK, captivity would not be a display of overwhelming wealth, but a lesson in austerity, discipline, and a unique psychological experiment designed to dismantle the Nazi ideology brick by brick. The German soldiers brought to Britain were colloquially known as His Majesty's guests. It was a phrase used with a dry British irony, but it carried a grain of truth. The British approach to handling the hundreds of thousands of German captives was distinctively different from the American mass processing or the French utilitarianism. The British viewed the prisoners not just as labor, but as a problem to be solved. They were obsessed with the question, what made these men tick? And how do we fix them? The journey to a British camp often began with a distinct sinking feeling. As the transport ships docked in ports like Hull or Liverpool, the prisoners looked out onto a landscape that was gray, wet, and visibly damaged. They saw the row houses with missing roofs, the rubble piles where shops used to be, and the tired faces of the dock workers. Unlike the shock of American prosperity, this was a familiar sight to the Germans. It looked like home. But the reception was icy. The British public had endured the V-1 and V-2 rocket attacks until the very end of the war. The hatred for the Hun was deep, personal, and quiet. There were no cheering crowds, just cold stares. Upon processing, the prisoners were introduced to the defining feature of the British system, the screening. While the Americans separated prisoners largely to maintain order, the British Political Intelligence Department, PID, developed a sophisticated system to categorize every single German soldier based on his political reliability. It was a massive bureaucratic undertaking involving interrogations, background checks, and psychological assessments. Each prisoner was assigned a patch color and a category. White, Category A, meant the prisoner was considered a convinced anti-Nazi or a Democrat. These were the men the British hoped would lead the new Germany. Gray, Category B, was the vast majority, the ordinary soldiers, the opportunists, the men who had followed orders and didn't care much for politics. They were seen as redeemable but requiring work. And then there were the blacks, Category C. These were the die-hard Nazis, the SS officers, the U-boat crews, and the fanatical Hitler Youth members. They were considered dangerous, unrepentant, and a threat to the other prisoners. This classification dictated a prisoner's entire existence. If you were white, you might be given privileges, freedom of movement, or even tasked with running camp administration. If you were black, you were sent to high-security camps in remote areas, isolated from the rest, to prevent them from poisoning the minds of the Greys. This segregation was crucial because, in the early days of captivity, the internal terror within the Wehrmacht didn't stop just because the guns had fallen silent. In camps where hardliners were mixed with moderates, the black prisoners organized secret tribunals. They terrorized those they deemed defeatists. There were grim incidents, such as the murder of Sergeant Wolfgang Rosterg at Camp 21 in Comrie, Scotland. Rosterg, a known anti-Nazi, was beaten and hanged by fellow prisoners, SS fanatics, who believed the war was not truly over. The British were horrified. The murder of Rosterg was a turning point that forced them to accelerate the screening and segregation process to protect those willing to embrace democracy. Life in a standard British POW camp was a study in monotony and dampness. The prisoners were housed mostly in Nissen huts, semi-cylindrical structures made of corrugated steel. In the winter, they were freezing ice boxes. In the summer, they were ovens. Inside, the air always smelled of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and coal dust. The beds were simple bunks with straw mattresses. The food was the biggest shock for those coming from the American sphere, or those who had heard rumors of the Golden Cage. Britain was starving. Rationing was strict for civilians, and it was strict for prisoners. A typical meal might consist of a slice of dark bread with a scrape of margarine, watery potato soup, and perhaps a small piece of Spam or bully beef. It was enough to survive, but never enough to feel full. The prisoners were constantly hungry. They became experts at scavenging. They collected nettles from the camp perimeter to boil into spinach. They trapped wild rabbits or birds if the guards weren't looking. But despite the hunger, there was a grudging respect for the British. The prisoners knew that the guards were eating barely better than they were. The fairness of the suffering created a strange sort of bond. The British were not starving the Germans out of malice. They were sharing their poverty. Work was the central pillar of daily life. With so many British men dead or still demobilizing, the country was suffering a crippling labor shortage. The 400,000 German prisoners became the engine of British agriculture and reconstruction. They were trucked out of the camps every morning to work on local farms, dig drainage ditches, clear bomb rubble, and repair roads. It was in the fields of the English countryside that the barriers began to break down. A German prisoner, perhaps a former mechanic from Stuttgart, would find himself working side by side with a British farmer in Yorkshire. At first, the silence would be heavy. But work has a universal language. The prisoner knew how to fix the tractor that had been broken for months. He knew how to calm a spooked horse. Slowly, the farmer would begin to see the prisoner not as a Nazi monster, but as a young man named Fritz, or Hans, who was good with his hands. The rules against fraternization were strict. British civilians were forbidden from speaking to prisoners, giving them food, or mailing letters for them. But human nature is persistent. It started with a cup of tea. The British ritual of tea breaks was sacrosanct. When the farmer stopped for tea, it felt unnatural to let the man working next to him stand there with nothing. So, a mug was offered, then a sandwich, then a conversation in broken English. There are thousands of stories of British housewives baking extra cakes, ostensibly for the boys, but leaving them in the barn where the prisoners were working. This interaction was transformative. For the German soldiers, who had been told by Goebbels that the British were degenerate imperialists, the reality of the quiet, stoic, and fair-minded British people was a revelation. They saw a society that functioned without shouting, without secret police, and with a deep-seated sense of fair play. But the British government had grander ambitions than just farm labor. They wanted to re-educate the enemy. This was the most unique aspect of the British captivity. The flagship of this effort was Wilton Park, a camp that functioned more like a university. Here, promising prisoners, intellectuals, teachers, journalists, were sent for intensive courses in democracy, history, and civics. The lectures were not brainwashing sessions, they were debates. The British invited German refugees, Jewish professors who had fled the Holocaust, and British politicians to speak to the prisoners. They encouraged the Germans to argue, to question, and to think for themselves. The man behind Wilton Park, Herbert Sulzbach, was a German Jewish officer from WWII who had fled to Britain. He addressed the prisoners as gentlemen, something they had not heard in years. He told them that they were the future of Germany and that they had to understand where their nation had gone wrong. This approach was incredibly effective. It treated the prisoners as adults capable of reason. Many of the men who passed through Wilton Park went on to become the editors, mayors, and civil servants of the new West Germany. They launched their own newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, which became a platform for democratic ideas written by prisoners for prisoners. However, the British experience was also marked by a deep sense of frustration and depression, particularly as time dragged on. The war ended in May 1945, but for the prisoners in Britain, freedom remained elusive. While the Americans sent many men home by 1946, the British held onto their prisoners well into 1947 and even 1948. The reason was cold economic necessity. Britain was bankrupt and could not afford to lose the labor force. The prisoners felt this keenly. They called it slave labor. They watched the seasons change, year after year, still behind barbed wire, while peace reigned in Europe. The psychological toll of this delayed repatriation was heavy. Depression was rampant. The term barbed wire disease a state of lethargy and hopelessness, became common. Men would stare at the fence for hours, unable to motivate themselves to wash or eat. To combat this, the camp culture evolved. The Germans turned their camps into mini-villages. They built theaters, formed orchestras with instruments donated by the Red Cross or handmade from scrap wood, and created elaborate education systems. At the island farm camp in Wales, which housed many senior officers, the prisoners created a university curriculum so advanced that some German universities later accepted credits earned there. Football became a religion. Every camp had a team, and the rivalries were intense. The most famous story to emerge from this was that of Bert Trautmann. A paratrooper who had fought on the Eastern Front, Trautmann was captured and sent to a camp in Lancashire. During camp matches, his skill as a goalkeeper was noticed by the locals. As restrictions on movement were relaxed in 1948, he started playing for a local English team, St. Helens Town. Crowds gathered to boo the Nazi, but they stayed to cheer his incredible saves. He eventually signed with Manchester City and became a legend of English football, famously playing the 1956 FA Cup final with a broken neck. Trautmann's story is the ultimate example of how the British experience allowed for individual redemption through integration. By late 1946 and 1947, the strict walls of the camps began to dissolve. The British government introduced a relaxation of rules. Prisoners who were considered low risk were allowed to leave the camp during the day unaccompanied. They could walk into the local village, go to the cinema, if they had the money, or attend church services. This was a surreal experience for both the prisoners and the villagers. Suddenly, the enemy was walking down the high street, nodding hello. Christmas played a special role in this thawing of relations. In 1946 and 1947, the government allowed British families to invite a prisoner into their home for Christmas dinner. It was a gesture of incredible generosity from a people who had lost so much. Thousands of families volunteered. A German soldier sitting by a British fireplace, playing with the children and sharing a meager Christmas pudding, experienced a profound emotional shift. It broke the cycle of hatred. Many of these Christmas dinners led to lifelong friendships. Some even led to marriage. Romance was the unspoken secret of the POW experience. Despite the threat of imprisonment for the women and punishment for the men, relationships blossomed. The shortage of British men in the villages, combined with the presence of fit, hard-working German soldiers, made it inevitable. They met in the fields, in the barns, or at village dances where prisoners were eventually allowed to attend. These relationships were fraught with difficulty. A British woman seen walking with a jerry could be shunned by her neighbors, or have her hair sheared off by angry locals. Yet, love persisted. When repatriation finally came, thousands of German men chose to stay in Britain to marry the women they had met. In fact, over 25,000 German POWs elected to remain in the UK after their release, settling down, becoming British citizens, and living out their lives in the country they had once tried to bomb into submission. But, for the majority, the end of captivity was a slow, staggered process. As the ships finally began to take them back to Hamburg or Bremerhaven in 1947 and 1948, the mood was bittersweet. They were going home, but home was a terrifying concept. They had read the letters. They knew about the starvation in Germany, the ruins, the occupation zones. In Britain, they had routine, they had safety, and they had survived. The British legacy on the German prisoner was one of discipline and democratization. The men who returned from the UK were different from those who came from Russia or France. They had been steeped in the parliamentary tradition. They had seen how a democracy functions under extreme stress. They carried with them the lessons of Wilton Park and the kindness of the Yorkshire farmers. The black prisoners, however, returned with a different mindset. The hardliners who had spent years in the isolated camps often remained unrepentant, viewing their treatment as a violation of their rights, cementing their bitterness. But they were a minority. The success of the British program was that it turned a massive, hostile army into a workforce and, eventually, into neighbors. Yet, as the last transport ships left the white cliffs of Dover, a much darker chapter was unfolding across the English Channel. While the British had offered austerity and re-education, the French were offering something far more primitive: retribution and dangerous labor. The men who had been handed over to the French, or captured by them directly, were not guests. They were tools to be used until they broke. The contrast we are about to explore is jarring. If the American camp was a farm, and the British camp was a school, the French camp was a minefield. Literally. As we prepare to uncover the brutal and often overlooked history of the French POWs TW experience, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. The story of the mine clearance commandos and the starvation in the French depots is a harrowing but essential part of this history that is rarely told in such detail. You won't want to miss the final dramatic conclusion to this saga. If the American experience was a physical restoration in a land of plenty, and the British experience was an intellectual project in a land of austerity, the French experience was a trial by fire. It was a descent into the rawest emotions left behind by the war: vengeance, desperation, and the brutal necessity of survival. For the German soldier in 1945, there was no fate more feared than falling into the hands of the French, except, perhaps, the Soviets. This fear was not unfounded. France was a nation that had been occupied, humiliated, and plundered for 4 years. Its industry was decimated, its agriculture was paralyzed, and its population was hungry. When the tables turned, the French government did not view the German prisoners as guests or potential Democrats. They viewed them as the instrument of their suffering and, subsequently, the tool for their reconstruction. The nightmare for many began with a bureaucratic betrayal. In the summer and autumn of 1945, the United States, overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners in its care and eager to demobilize its own troops, handed over roughly 700,000 German POWs to the French authorities. For the prisoners, this was a crushing psychological blow. Many had been in American camps, fed on U.S. rations, and told they were being processed for release. They were loaded onto trains or trucks, believing they were heading for the German border and home. Instead, they were driven across the Rhine into France. The realization hit them when they saw the uniforms of the guards change from olive drab to the mismatched khaki of the French army, often worn by men who had been partisans in the resistance just months before. The hostility was immediate and visceral. As the trucks passed through French villages, civilians who had lost fathers and sons to the Gestapo or the Wehrmacht lined the streets to spit, throw stones, and scream at the passing convoys. The golden cage was gone. The initial conditions in the French camps, known as dépôts de guerre, were catastrophic. In the chaos of post-war France, the logistics of feeding and housing nearly 1 million prisoners simply did not exist. The French state was barely functioning. Consequently, the German prisoners starved. In the winter of 1945-1946, mortality rates spiked. Men who had survived the Eastern Front found themselves dying of malnutrition in the muddy fields of Champagne or Normandy. There were camps where the inmates resembled the skeletal figures found in the concentration camps, a horrifying irony that was not lost on the Red Cross inspectors who desperately tried to intervene. The prisoners dug holes in the ground to sleep, possessed no blankets, and ate soup made from rotten cabbage or unwashed potato peelings. It was not necessarily a calculated policy of extermination, but rather a reflection of a broken country. France could not feed its own children. There was nothing left for the enemy. However, the true horror of the French captivity was not the hunger. It was the work. The French government argued that since Germany had laid millions of mines along the French coast, the famous Atlantic Wall, it was Germany's responsibility to remove them. This logic, driven by a grim sense of poetic justice, led to the creation of the mine clearance commandos. Thousands of German prisoners were drafted into these units. They were sent to the beaches of Normandy, the dunes of Brittany, and the fields of the Mediterranean coast. The work was terrifyingly simple and lethal. With minimal training and primitive equipment, often just a long stick or a bayonet, the men were ordered to crawl across the sands, prodding the ground inch by inch. The tension of this work is hard to imagine. A prisoner would spend his entire day on his stomach, the smell of salt spray and sweat in his nose, listening for the faint clink of metal on metal. One wrong move, one shift in the sand, and the bouncing Betty, or the anti-tank mine, would detonate. Casualties were horrific. There are accounts of men marching into minefields arm in arm to clear them with their bodies, though the official French records deny this extreme method. However, the accident rate was undeniable. Thousands of German prisoners were killed or maimed, losing eyes, hands, and legs years after the ceasefire had been signed. For the French, this was reparations in blood. For the prisoners, it was a death sentence that could strike at any second. The Geneva Convention strictly forbade using prisoners for dangerous labor, including mine clearance, but in the anger of 1945, international law was often ignored. It wasn't until the United States and the Red Cross applied significant diplomatic pressure, threatening to stop food aid, that the French authorities began to phase out the use of POWs for this deadly task in 1947. Yet, as with the British and American experiences, time began to heal even the deepest wounds. The vast majority of prisoners in France were not on the beaches. They were in the mines and on the farms. France needed coal to restart its industry, and German prisoners were sent deep underground into the pits of northern France. It was back-breaking, dangerous work in darkness, but it earned them better rations. The turning point for human relations came once again in the countryside. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were leased out to French farmers. Here, the dynamic shifted from national vengeance to individual survival. A French peasant woman, whose husband might have been killed in the war, suddenly found herself with a German man working in her barn. At first, he was the enemy, slept in the stable, and ate scraps, but a farm requires teamwork. When the cow was calving at 3 a.m., the German and the French woman worked side by side to save it. When the harvest threatened to rot in the rain, They worked the fields together until exhaustion set in. Slowly, the word Boche, a derogatory slur for Germans, was replaced by Jean or Michel, French versions of their names. The prisoners began to eat at the family table. They learned French. They repaired the farmhouse roofs that their own army might have damaged years prior. By 1947 and 1948, a strange phenomenon occurred. Many French farmers petitioned the government to let their German stay longer because he had become part of the family. The hatred that existed on the political level dissolved on the personal level. The repatriation from France was the slowest of the Western Allies. The French government, desperate for labor, held on to the prisoners until the very last moment allowed by international treaties. It wasn't until late 1948, and for some as late as 1949, that the bulk of the men were finally released. This leads us to the final, crushing chapter of the POW saga, the return. Whether they came from the cotton fields of Texas, the lecture halls of Wilton Park, or the coal mines of France, the return to Germany was a shock that few were prepared for. During their years of captivity, the prisoners had constructed a fantasy of Heimat, home. They remembered the Germany of 1939 or 1940, a country of order, intact cities, and family life. They were returning to a moonscape. The trains carrying the Heimkehrer, homecoming prisoners, would pull into stations that no longer had roofs. As they traveled through the country, they saw the scale of the destruction. Cities like Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden were not just damaged, they were obliterated. Mountains of rubble stood where their schools and churches had been. The smell of the cities was distinct, a mixture of wet plaster, old fires, and decay. The reunion with families was often traumatic. The men who stepped off the trains were not the same men who had left. They were older, harder, often suffering from what we would now call PTSD. They returned to wives who had been forced to become the heads of households, women who had survived the bombings, the mass rapes by the Soviet occupation forces in the East, and the starvation of the post-war winters. These were the Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, the legendary generation of women who were literally clearing the streets of Germany with their bare hands while the men were gone. The power dynamic in the German home had shifted. The returning soldier expected to resume his role as the patriarch, but he found a wife who had learned to survive without him, and children who barely recognized him. A child who was 2 years old when his father left for the Eastern Front was now 8 or 9, viewing this gaunt, silent stranger with suspicion. There was also the crushing realization of moral catastrophe. In the camps, particularly in the US and UK, the prisoners had been shown the films of the Holocaust. Many had dismissed it as propaganda. But upon returning to Germany, the silence was deafening. The truth was inescapable. The nation they had fought for had committed crimes of industrial magnitude. The returning soldier had to reconcile his own service, his own sacrifices and suffering, with the fact that he had served a criminal regime. This created a wall of silence in German families. The fathers did not talk about the war. The mothers did not talk about the rapes or the hunger. They simply worked. They threw themselves into the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, rebuilding the country with a manic energy to forget the past. The fate of the prisoners also depended heavily on where in Germany they lived. A prisoner returning from a comfortable American camp to a home in the Soviet occupation zone, East Germany, faced a bitter irony. He had survived the war in the Golden Cage, only to return to a dictatorship, where he could be monitored by the secret police. Conversely, a prisoner returning to West Germany found himself in a society rapidly aligning with his former captors against the new Soviet threat. In the end, the experience of the German POWs in the West is a story of profound transformation. Over 11 million German soldiers were captured. Those who went east to the Soviet gulags faced a death rate of over 30% and a captivity that lasted well into the mid-1950s. But for those in the West, the survival rate was incredibly high. These men, the Heimkehrer, became the foundation of modern Germany. The man who learned democracy at Wilton Park became a town mayor. The man who learned modern farming techniques in Nebraska revolutionized German agriculture. The man who survived the minefields of France learned the value of a united Europe, where such wars would be impossible. They carried the scars of their experience, the frostbite from the Rhine meadows, the nightmares from the minefields, the shame of the black label. But they also carried the lessons of their captors. They had seen the immense power of the United States, the stoic fairness of the British, and the desperate resilience of the French. The story of the German POW is not a story of heroes. It is a story of the defeated. But in their defeat, and in the way they were treated, with varying degrees of mercy, pragmatism, and severity, lies the story of how the West rebuilt itself from the ashes of the greatest catastrophe in human history. It is a testament to the fact that even after total war, enemies can become neighbors and eventually allies. This journey from the muddy banks of the Rhine to the skyline of New York, from the classrooms of England to the minefields of France, shows us the complexity of human nature in the aftermath of conflict. It reminds us that history is not just about the generals and the maps, but about the millions of individuals caught in the machinery of war, waiting for the day they could finally go home. Thank you for joining us on this extensive journey through history. If you want to support more deep-dive documentaries like this and ensure we can keep telling these important stories, please click that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have many more untold chapters of history to explore, and we want you there with us.